I would worry if I was Putin, and I know a lot of Russians are worried about this, is the possibility that China is watching Russia bleed itself dry and become so weak there's a certain point at which China looks at it and says, you know what, we're not going to do Taiwan, we're going to do Siberia. And this was a war game. The Americans, the Pentagon, used to have a war game in the 90s where they would, where China would invade Siberia, and the Americans ended up fighting with the Russians to get Siberia back. Now, I can't see that happening. I can't see that happening. I can see Xi causing great trouble, probably not for Putin, but for who follows him. I can see that happen. I can imagine that happening. But you have to understand there is a big difference between the way Russia and China looks at the West. Russia's narrative, story to the Russian people, Putin's narrative to the Russian people is, you don't want to be like the West, we're all gay and transgender and it's all a mess. You don't want to be like the West. And the Chinese think the same, and they don't like our concerns about human rights and democracy in China, the whole thing, but also in Hong Kong, for the Tibetans, for the Muslims, in Xinjiang. But also there is a difference. For the Chinese economy to work, it needs Americans and Europeans and Brits to keep on buying iPhones built in China, all of that. And if we don't, then the Chinese economy is in serious trouble. And it's not perfect by any means. So I think that Xi will continue to play both ends, but I think he would be foolish to come down thoroughly on Russia's side, in particular, because it's clear that Russia is not winning. And by the way, I mean, I see the latest results. What's happening is the Ukrainians are it's not masses of land, but they are picking up territory across the front line. And that's a narrative which must really irritate Trump and the other useful idiots in the White House. And it will certainly irritate the killer in the Kremlin and his cronies there, because what the hell is happening? The big story, Trump's story, is the Ukrainians have got no cards. Well, hold on a second. They've got something like the Jack of Spades and the Queen of Diamonds and maybe, the King of Hearts. They're doing very well for for a player with no cards. That's true. That's true.
If I grasp your idea correctly, you count on midterm elections in United States and economic collapse in Russia for getting situation worse for Putin.
Yes. Those are the two things. Now, separately, he's getting old. He's an old man. And by the way, the gossip is that he said to all of his generals and his old buddies from St. Petersburg, from the gangster days, from Leningrad, don't retire. But these are old men. So he likes working with people he's known his entire life and seeing people. So his crew, his gang, are people he's known his entire life. And they're old. Some of them are starting to die. Some of them want to spend time with their grandchildren. Of course they do. They're human beings. And Putin is saying, don't retire. But he can't say to them, don't die. And at some point, some of them will start to die. And then what happens is that they'll be replaced. So a general will be replaced by somebody who's now a colonel or a young general who's 50, not 70. And Putin's afraid of these people because they're much younger men who might say, you know what, I'd quite like to be president. And they're the kind of people who will call up the guard, who will say, okay, we're going to storm the Kremlin. And then you've got the oligarchs, so who pours Putin's tea? is it has it been the same Char lady
Mm-hmm.
for forever, or is it somebody they can get at? And by the way, I'm like, this is my educated guess, but the Ukrainians are getting pretty good at knocking off Russian officers who have clearly perpetrated war crimes. And then you think, well, like, oh, there's that guy, he was responsible for Bupa. The Ukrainians are getting very good at that. And if the Ukrainians can do it, so can some of the Russian oligarchs. And now, what do I think? I also think it's entirely possible that Putin can dial up the repression of the Russian state. So I'm not, by the way, I'm not speculating, or rather, I do not predict a Russian revolution. So I did Russian at school, and I had a love affair with Russia, a love affair which I now bitterly regret because of the inhumanity I've seen with which Russia has prosecuted this horrible war. And I know, well, for me, the killing starts with the Second Chechen War. That's the one I first saw the Russian army at play, if you like, in 2000. And it was hideous. Then there's the war against Georgia. There's a kind of proxy war where Russia sides with Bashar al-Assad against the Syrian people. Then there is the hideous stealing of Crimea and the eastern Donbass, and while the West go, well, it's okay, we don't do enough about that. And then the big war from 22 onwards. So, there's the pattern of behavior. But I feel that it's possible that Putin can crank up the machinery of terror. In the course of reporting on Russia, I met 4 Russians who were critical of Putin. They were Anna Politkovskaya, Natasha Esmerova, Boris Nemtsov, and Alexei Navalny. In order, poisoned, then shot, poisoned, survived, poisoned, died. So the message to ordinary people in Russia is, do not with the Kremlin or you'll end up dead. Like Anna, like Natasha, like Boris, like Alexei. So I do not think there will be a Russian revolution like there was in February 1917. I do think it's possible that there is a palace coup, or there could be a palace coup plotted by the oligarchs or plotted by a young general who's sick of this nonsense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I got you, John. Actually, I would like to expand our discussion in terms of Putin's way of thinking about his perception of war. What I mean, how do you understand current Putin's logic in terms of the war? I mean, what is he counting on when it comes to Ukraine's defeat? How is he going to win in his perception?
Are you going to ask any easy questions, Max? Because that's a real bugger. Listen, the whole war is crazy. I mean, I was talking about it to some friends just now, and I was in Kyiv when it happened for the big war, and I said to myself, well, this doesn't make sense because there's 200,000 people in the Ukrainian army at that time, February 22, and there's another 100,000 in the police and in customs, bits and bobs. So there's 300,000 people with guns, underarms in Ukraine in uniform. So normally the ratio when you attack is that you would expect to lose 3 people for every defender you kill, 3-to-1 ratio. Therefore, Russia to take Kyiv needed an army of 900,000 But what happens if the Ukrainians are fighting like tigers and the ratio isn't 3-1, it's 7-1? Then Russia would need an army of 2.1 million. And I think it was more like that. But what Russia attacked Ukraine with was an army of 200,000, i.e., a tenth of the necessary number to achieve victory. Now, what Putin thought was that everybody in Ukraine kind of agreed with him that actually Russia was really Ukrainian, and therefore, and the idea of Ukrainian nationalism, Ukraine was its own country, its own nation, was silly, was a fairy story, wrong, completely and utterly wrong. Remember when Ukraine voted for independence? Your listeners will know all this, but essentially every single oblast, including Crimea, where there were a lot of Russian officers enjoying the sunshine down there, they all voted to join Ukraine, for the ending of the Soviet Union, to join Ukraine. Every single oblast, obviously the heavy Ukrainian patriotic communities to the west, the numbers were massive, but even in Crimea, it was more than 50%. So Putin's start point for the war, the big war, was based on a fiction, was based on nonsense, a fairy story. The problem is that there is nobody around him left who can say, listen, boss, that's not going to work. I think the one man who got it was, who's the head of the SVR? Is it Natrushin? Am I pronouncing him correct? This is the head of the intelligence service, the SVR, who 4 years ago, there was that big sort of crazy meeting of Putin and his advisors in the Kremlin. Mm-hmm. And he went around the table, who's in favor of the special military operation? Yeah. And it's Natrushin. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Could you repeat, please?
It's the head of the SVR. I think
it's Patrushev.
It's Patrushev, yeah.
Patrushev, yeah.
Patrushev, he's the guy who hesitates, who stumbles, who gets he's the actor who gets his line wrong. And the story about Patrushev is he knows, he's got good intelligence about the Ukrainian attitude, and the Ukrainian attitude is they're going to fight. And Putin got it into his head that they weren't. This is the head of the SVR. That's why that's why I'm talking about the guy who was nervous. And maybe it wasn't Patrushev, maybe it was somebody else. Anyway, the question is what's happening now? And I think that Putin continues to be told fairy stories by the people around him. Remember, he doesn't use the internet. He doesn't properly understand the 21st century. He'd like the world to go back to 1975 or something like this, when he joined the KGB. That's when the world was good as far as he's concerned. So this guy, there's and this is a sort of ziggurat. So the Kremlin is run like a ziggurat, not like a neural computer. Now all the smart AI stuff, the good commanders in war are open to information from wherever it comes. Now you've got to assess it and weigh it. But what you don't do is get yourself locked into a sick thing that you only hear what you want to hear. Putin's problem is he's only hearing what he wants to hear. So, for example, Putin boasts that the Russians have got Kupiansk. And then, the next week, guess what? Zelensky pops up and there's Kupiansk in the background because the Ukrainians have got Kupiansk back. And Putin could only make that mistake because the generals around him are telling him what he wants to hear. At some point, Max, there's going to be a moment, and I'd love to be a fly on the wall when it happens, when Vladimir Putin does a kind of reprise of the great scene in Downfall, when Hitler says, where's our Sixth Army? And then one by one, his pathetic creeps and yes men have to say there isn't a sixth army, and then Hitler goes nuts at some point. At some point, Trump's gonna, sorry, Trump, Putin is going to learn the truth. The problem, of course, is that the people who are telling him things, his information stream, is poisoned. So he doesn't understand what's happening. And the way to end the war is to deliver Ukraine the material, the weapons, the machinery, so that they can crush the Russian army in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And then, and only then, will Putin get it.